Hello, my name is Candy Block, and this video you are going to learn how to plan, host, and execute a virtual event. A little bit of background about myself. I have been a wedding planner since 2015. I've owned my own wedding planning company. I've hosted over 100 different weddings and corporate events during that time. In 2019, I founded Right Hearted Weddings, which is a planning app, a little bit like Tinder or Bumble, but we connect engaged couples with wedding professionals. I will say 2020 has thrown quite a wrench into the wedding industry. And during this time, we're seeing people do a lot of different things. So some are choosing to move their celebrations, postpone so they can still have an in-person event. But we're also seeing a lot of individuals choose to move things online and host some virtual celebrations. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about here. I'm in the wedding industry, so I will give you a lot of examples from weddings. I actually just had two friends move their in-person wedding into an online celebration just this past weekend. They're based in New York. They had friends and family flying in from 19 different states, and so they decided to have a Zoom wedding, and it was awesome. So I'm going to give you guys some examples, but just know that that's a jumping off point. So this video is going to be helpful whether you're doing a wedding, a birthday party, an anniversary, a graduation, anything that you want to celebrate, this will be applicable. I'm also going to reference Zoom quite a bit. That's the platform that has really just become the biggest thing during the pandemic, but it's definitely not the only platform. So I just want to let you know that there is actually a really great Reno-based startup called Icebreaker that if you are hosting any kind of celebration where guests may not know each other super well, Icebreaker allows everybody to come together in a group chat, and then you can send people out into breakout rooms so they can talk one-on-one with their videos on. It gives you some question prompts to really get conversations going. So again, Zoom is not the only thing that you can use, but it is what I'm going to reference here since I think most people are most familiar with Zoom. With that, I'm going to actually share my screen so that way you're not just staring at me this entire time. And we will jump in. All right, so I actually have 3 tips for planning and then 3 tips for executing and actually hosting your virtual celebration. So we'll get started with planning. The first tip is actually just deciding how you want your celebration to look and feel. Now, the look of things is probably where it's going to vary the most from an in-person celebration to virtual. You don't necessarily need huge decorations, you don't need table settings or centerpieces or large installations, but you can definitely still go out and either make some decorations or buy some decorations that you can put behind you as the host of the celebration. I really want to talk about how a celebration feels because that's where you can really get creative with a virtual event. For the feel, you want to think about the experience that your guests are having. And a lot of times this is through activities. When you think about activities, for any women that are listening to this, you might want to think about bridal showers or baby showers or birthday parties too, like kids' birthday parties. Anything where there are activities like games where guests are interacting with each other, they're having some fun, it's getting people loose and conversations going. Those types of things work really well for virtual celebrations. What I've seen some people do are have different quizzes online where people are answering questions. They can keep track of their progress. It might be a great way to get to know the hosts or different people that are at the event. But games work really well. So that's a great jumping off point. Next, you might want to consider favors and gifts. Now, a lot of times with the virtual celebrations, people haven't really been thinking about this, but it's a great way to get your guests involved and excited. I'll give you an example from my friend's wedding. Prior to, they actually sent everybody this tea blend mix that was custom made for them, reusable tea bags, and then there's 3 different cards here. The first was their save the date and regular invitation, and then we created a card that went with the tea and was sent in the mail. So it's really hard to see on here, but it says, make a cup of tea and join us virtually. And so this was a way for them to really show their guests that while the wedding wasn't going to be what they originally planned, it was going to be a little more casual because it was online and people were in their homes and on their couches, that it was still important to them. They wanted to give their guests something. They wanted to get them excited. And this definitely did the trick because people loved getting them in the mail the week leading up to their virtual wedding. So definitely get creative and still consider if there are things that you could send out to guests prior to the event. Kind of going back to the activities and the planning, just make sure if you're choosing any games or quizzes where you need to actually collect information from guests, you're giving yourself plenty of time to do that prior to the virtual event. Another example from this wedding in person, they were actually going to have a tree set up in the park where the ceremony was going to be, where guests would write down on a piece of paper a wish for them and then tie it to a branch. Because they couldn't do that, they actually converted that into a virtual option. So they sent out a Google form to everybody prior to the wedding where people could input a wish and send it to them. Then they actually wrote those out on the paper and tied them to a long string that then hung from the mantle behind them. So it served as decoration, but also an activity where, you know, guests were submitting something prior to. So all of those are options for you. Next up is to choose a day and time. Now this might seem pretty obvious. You're going to do this regardless if it's an in-person or a virtual event, but there's two pieces that I want to talk about specifically. Save the dates or invitations. And you have two options here. So the first is an Evite. And I think some people have really thought that they're limited to an Evite because it's a virtual event, but that is definitely not the case. For, you know, more traditional events or, you know, big events like weddings or a big anniversary or even a graduation. Graduation, a lot of times people are sending out like their senior pictures. Sending a paper invitation is still totally fine. You can include, you know, the Zoom link details or more information on that card. So don't feel limited, but you do have, you know, both options. The Evite is nice because people are getting it online. It's an online event. It just gets them kind of in the right headspace. And then second with this is RSVPs. And really the question here is whether or not you want to track RSVPs. I would consider this one of the biggest bonuses to virtual events is that RSVPs are much less important. Without any kind of venue capacity to worry about, without ordering food or beverages for everybody, knowing the exact number of people that will come to the event, again, is a little bit less important. If you are mailing something out to your guests, then yes, you might want to know who's coming and who's not, so you're only spending the time and money on those that will be at the event. But RSVPs are really pretty optional here. One bonus tip for you, if you are converting an in-person event into a virtual celebration, make sure you're keeping your guests informed along the way as you're making decisions. I think one of the mindsets that people get into is that they don't want to update their guests until they have all of the answers for them. And that's pretty unrealistic. Things are changing daily and weekly. So it's better to just give your guests small updates as you're making changes and decisions rather than try to give it to them all at once. With this, I recommend choosing a method of communication that works and then being really consistent with it. So for a lot of the weddings that we've been working with clients making changes, we've told them to just update their guests saying, from the very beginning, we're monitoring the situation and we will follow up with more details. So even if you haven't decided whether or not to move it online yet, even just that basic update will help your guests quite a bit. And then you can, let them know as you're making official changes and then also follow up with actual really detailed plans once those are in place. Your method of communication, it could look like a website for our weddings. A lot of them have wedding websites. You might have an email list that you're sending information to. You're using social media. You could also have a group text or even just like a phone call chain with family and friends. I know for me, when I call my parents, they'll call my aunts and uncles and then they'll tell my cousins. And so any type of family event, that's usually kind of how information is dispersed. But maybe choose a couple of different methods of of communication, and then again, be consistent with them. Next, again, as you get closer to that event and you have details, make sure you're sending that information out multiple times. I recommend at a minimum 3 times. You're going to want to send it a week out, 2 to 3 days prior, and then the day of. So again, this would usually go to somebody's inbox, but that way it's top of mind and easy to access on the day of the event. And then the third tip is to get familiar with the technology. And this is so important. Often, if you're doing any kind of work from home, and again, you're using Zoom and having meetings, you might not really think too much about this, but it can be really important to practice, because if you're not typically in the host role on Zoom, or you're not using all of the capabilities like sharing your screen, using breakout rooms, sharing audio, all of that can feel a little bit clunky. So I recommend having a presentation, or not a presentation, just a practice session with yourself. I'll give you an example. I did a virtual vow writing workshop earlier this year in April for all of our couples that were on the app. And I wanted to have a little bit of a kind of a break in the middle where they were going to be doing some journaling and reflecting and kind of starting the writing process. So I wanted to have some background music. So I actually just did a practice session with my husband, and I was, putting up my PowerPoint slides and then figuring out how I could get the audio to go in the background without them seeing my Spotify or my desktop, and getting the right sound levels, and having somebody on the Zoom call with me to just verify, like, yeah, I can hear that, or I can't hear that at all on my end, was just really helpful, and it made everything run so much smoother. So have a practice session with yourself. And then I also recommend hosting a rehearsal or a practice group session if you have any guests that are less tech savvy. Sometimes this can be helpful in your family if you have parents or grandparents or older aunts and uncles that maybe haven't used Zoom. Having a rehearsal prior is just going to ease a lot of their anxieties about how they join and getting the software downloaded. If it's somebody's first time using Zoom, it takes a few extra minutes to get things downloaded and up to date. And so just having a practice session can be really helpful. You want your guests to enjoy the virtual celebration. And if anybody's worried about the technology, they're really not going to be present in the moment and just enjoying that with you. So have a practice session. And that leads us to how you're actually going to host and execute the event. So I have 3 more quick tips for you here. The first is that you don't have to do it alone. You can and should create a co-hosting team. Now, this team is going to be really helpful for you to get their mics muted and unmuted. They can help you manage breakout rooms. In the beginning, they can help you admit guests. So if you're still trying to, get something ready in the background and people are joining, they can manage that. We actually had, so my friends that got married had a co-hosting team that was myself, the bride's sister, and then the groom's brother. And so between us 3, we knew all of the guests' names at least, and that way we could admit people and make sure that we didn't have any Zoom wedding crashers during that time. But again, this team is just going to be really helpful for those kind of like little background tasks that you need. I also recommend having somebody as your IT point person. Now, this is just going to be helpful because if you're hosting and trying to say hi to people and getting people in the chat and maybe still trying to get something ready, if one of your guests is having issues logging on or can't get their sound to work or their camera to work, you don't necessarily want to have to step away and handle that in that moment. So having an IT point person can just really take all of that stress off of your shoulders so you can worry about hosting all of your guests rather than just dealing with like one problem. In those emails that you send out prior to the celebration with, your Zoom link and details, you can include this person's contact information as well. So if somebody is having issues getting into the event, they know who to reach out to. And then at the beginning of the event, I recommend having this person just pop their phone number into the chat so that way it's there if anybody, needs to reach out to them. And then the last person that's kind of on the co-hosting team is somebody that can help you MC. Now, if you're really comfortable and you want to MC, you absolutely can MC your own event. But if you're not, or you just want to be able to sit back and relax and enjoy and kind of be present with all of your guests, then having somebody else lay out the ground rules and go through the schedule and introduce the games or what's coming up next can be really helpful. And that's going to actually be a key component to the entire thing running really smoothly. So those are the roles that I recommend you have in your co-hosting team. And then speaking of some ground rules and schedule, I highly recommend going through this at the very beginning of your celebration or event. So I'll share a picture with you. This is from my friend's wedding. They actually had this up on the screen as people were coming into the event. And so they had a 4 p.m. ceremony time. They encouraged guests to come in at 3:45. And then again, like I mentioned, there's the co-hosting team. So as people were arriving, we could help them, which was really great because they, were kind of saying hi to people as they were coming on, getting people to talk in the chat, waving at people, and then we were in the background just admitting them. This is great. Again, if you're doing lots of meetings for work or you're on Zoom all the time, keeping yourself muted is going to be like a no-brainer, but you might have people that are not on Zoom a lot, or they just might not realize that their mic isn't muted. And so just having these reminders like front and center as people are coming into the event is going to be really helpful. And then taking just a little bit of time at the beginning to go over the schedule for the day. I'll give you a little bit of a bonus tip here as well. Always encourage your guests to arrive early, especially for the Zoom meetings where people have to be admitted. But what I loved that they did, they had a 4 p.m. ceremony start time, but at 4 o'clock, they did not jump right into the ceremony. So what they did was actually send everybody out into a breakout room. They're like, hey, we want you to meet somebody new that you don't already know before we actually get started with the ceremony. So that kept all of the guests entertained that had already been on the call for like 10 minutes or so because they got there early. It gave them an activity. People were meeting somebody new, and then it gave any latecomers just a little bit more of a buffer. So that way, they could still get in. And then when the ceremony started, they actually locked the Zoom room. And that way, again, we didn't have any crashers or people coming in that we didn't know. And then finally, you'll want to make sure that you're giving your guests some breaks on throughout the event. So think about an actual in-person event. People have more freedom to just get up and walk around, go to the bathroom, grab more food, have these little side conversations. But when you're sitting in a chair and you're looking at a screen, you don't necessarily have those breaks. And even if you're doing a short party that might only be a couple of hours, just giving people a quick short break right in the middle is going to be so helpful. So when you do this, I recommend putting on some kind of background entertainment. What works really well is a slideshow where you can share your screen. You can also just put on some background audio, and that way it doesn't feel like the event is coming to just, a halt, but it still is giving people a break where if they're, not going to the bathroom or not getting food, they can just like sit back, relax, and watch it. But it's also something that is not really where they have to be actively engaged in it either. And then during the breaks, I do encourage you to tell your guests, turn off your camera, get up, move around. This doesn't have to be a time where you're like, actively engaged, but just really taking a break for yourself, get the blood moving, and then you can come back, sit down, and go back to staring at your screen. As we get into this, I'm sure you guys have heard of Zoom fatigue. So during events, you just really want to be conscious of that. Especially if you are doing multiple activities or have people on the Zoom event for more than a couple of hours. Again, during the breaks, they don't have to leave Zoom, so just encourage people to turn off their mic and turn off their camera while they're taking a break. And then finally, just as a bonus tip, don't forget to have fun. This is just a really unprecedented time. I think all of your guests are going to recognize that having an in-person celebration would have been your preferred method, but you're making the best out of a bad situation. You're moving things online. You're still trying to get creative, and guests will really appreciate that. More than anything, just focus on connecting with the people that you care about. Being able to talk to them, getting people into the chat, having some fun activities. If you run into a small technical glitch, laugh it off, keep your guests informed, and try to move past it as quickly as you can, but really don't sweat any kind of small things like that. So make sure that you have fun. If you have any questions about planning or any questions about this presentation, I'm happy to help. Here's my direct email. And then a shameless plug, if you are planning a wedding, you can download our free app. It's Right Hearted Weddings. We are on Google Play and the App Store. Whether you're hosting a smaller elopement right now or you're waiting and planning a larger event later, we have a ton of talented local wedding professionals on there that would love to help you. And so that is a great, fun way to get connected with them. And again, totally free app. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you feel more prepared than ever to plan and host and execute your virtual celebration. Happy planning. Bye.